Confirmation bias. This is probably the most widespread cognitive bias there is, and most people who have it never notice it working. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, favor, and remember information that agrees with what you already believe, while unconsciously filtering out information that contradicts it. If you believe a certain diet is healthy, you will notice every article that supports that view and quietly dismiss or forget the ones that challenge it. If you have already formed an opinion about a person, you will interpret their behavior in ways that confirm what you already think of them. The bias operates mostly below conscious awareness, which is what makes it so persistent. It is not that people are being deliberately dishonest with themselves. The brain is simply more comfortable with information that fits its existing picture of the world, and it processes confirming information more easily and with less scrutiny than challenging information. This has serious real-world consequences. In medicine, a doctor who forms an early diagnosis may unconsciously interpret later symptoms through that lens rather than remaining fully open. In politics, people on opposite sides of an issue can read the same set of facts and come away more convinced than ever that they were right to begin with. The only reliable counter to confirmation bias is deliberately seeking out the strongest version of the argument against your own position, which is harder than it sounds and requires genuine effort every time. The Dunning-Kruger effect. Few psychological findings have entered popular culture as quickly or as thoroughly as this one, though it is also one of the most commonly misunderstood. The Dunning-Kruger effect describes the tendency for people with limited knowledge or skill in a particular area to overestimate their own competence, while people with genuine expertise tend to underestimate theirs. It was named after psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger, who published a study on it in 1999, and the core finding was both simple and striking. People who performed worst on tests of logic, grammar, and humor were the most likely to believe they had done well. The reason is not arrogance exactly. It is that the skills needed to evaluate your own performance in a domain are the same skills you develop as you become competent in that domain. If you have not yet developed those skills, you also lack the ability to accurately measure your own gaps. As people learn more, they typically go through a phase of feeling less confident, not more, because they begin to see how much complexity they were previously unaware of. True expertise tends to produce humility rather than certainty. The practical implication of this is worth sitting with. In any situation where someone is speaking with great confidence about a complex topic, that confidence alone tells you very little about whether they actually know what they are talking about. Anchoring bias. The first piece of information you receive about something tends to have a disproportionate influence on every judgment you make about it afterward, even when that initial information is arbitrary or irrelevant. This is anchoring bias, and it operates across an enormous range of human decisions. In one classic experiment, participants were asked to spin a wheel that was secretly rigged to land on either 10 or 65, and then asked to estimate the percentage of African countries in the United Nations. People who spun a high number gave significantly higher estimates than people who spun a low number, even though the wheel result had absolutely nothing to do with the question. The same effect appears in salary negotiations, where the first number mentioned pulls the entire conversation toward it. It appears in retail pricing, where a crossed-out original price makes a discount feel more significant. It appears in legal sentencing, where studies have shown that suggested sentencing lengths influence judges even when those suggestions are made by people with no legal authority. The anchor does not have to be accurate or relevant to have an effect. Once a number or idea is in your mind as a starting point, adjusting away from it requires active mental effort, and most people do not adjust far enough, even when they try. The sunk cost fallacy. Humans have a deep and largely irrational tendency to continue investing time, money, or effort into something simply because they have already put a lot into it, even when the rational choice is clearly to stop. This is the sunk cost fallacy, and it drives an enormous amount of poor decision-making at every level of human activity. The name comes from economics, where a sunk cost refers to money already spent that cannot be recovered regardless of what happens next. Economically, sunk costs should be irrelevant to future decisions because the money is gone either way. But psychologically, walking away from something you have already invested in feels like a loss, and the brain works hard to avoid the feeling of loss. So people stay in careers they dislike because they spent years training for them. They finish films they are not enjoying because they paid for the ticket. They continue funding failing projects because stopping would mean admitting the previous investment was wasted. Businesses do this too, sometimes catastrophically, continuing to pour resources into a failing product or strategy, because the alternative is acknowledging that everything spent so far produced nothing. The cleaner mental frame is to ask only one question in those situations. If I had not already invested anything, would I choose to start this now? If the answer is no, the past investment is not a reason to continue. Availability heuristic. The human brain tends to judge how likely something is based on how easily an example of it comes to mind, rather than on actual statistical probability. This shortcut is called the availability heuristic, and while it often works reasonably well, it produces some striking and consequential errors. After a plane crash receives weeks of media coverage, people dramatically overestimate the danger of flying and underestimate the danger of driving, even though the statistics point clearly in the opposite direction. After a shark attack story goes viral, beach attendance drops and fear of sharks spikes, even in regions where encounters are extraordinarily rare. The effect is not stupidity. It is the brain using a useful but imperfect rule of thumb. If something comes to mind quickly and vividly, it must be common or dangerous. The problem is that what comes to mind quickly is shaped heavily by media, by emotional intensity, and by how recently something happened, none of which reliably correlates with actual frequency or risk. This has significant consequences for public policy. Governments and voters frequently allocate attention and resources toward dramatic, visible risks rather than quiet, statistical ones. Terrorism receives vastly more policy attention than road safety, even in countries where road deaths outnumber terrorism deaths by thousands to one, partly because terrorist attacks are vivid and memorable in a way that daily traffic statistics are not. The halo effect. When we form a strong positive impression of someone in one area, we tend to unconsciously extend that positive judgment into unrelated areas without any real evidence. This is the halo effect, and it shapes human judgment far more than most people are comfortable admitting. Physically attractive people are consistently rated as more intelligent, more competent, more trustworthy, and more moral than less attractive people in studies conducted across many different cultures and contexts. Tall people are disproportionately represented in leadership positions. People who speak with confidence are judged as more knowledgeable even when their actual knowledge is no greater than someone who speaks hesitantly. The effect was named by psychologist Edward Thorndike in the early 20th century after he noticed that military officers who rated soldiers highly on one trait tended to rate them highly on all traits, and officers who rated one trait low tended to rate everything low. The halo travels in both directions, which is why the negative version is sometimes called the horn effect. Once we have a bad impression of someone, we start interpreting their neutral actions as suspicious or incompetent. The halo effect is one of the reasons that first impressions carry so much weight and are so difficult to reverse, and it is deeply embedded in hiring decisions, performance reviews, and courtroom judgments in ways that most participants would firmly deny if asked. Negativity bias. The human brain pays more attention to negative information than positive information, weighs it more heavily in decisions, and remembers it more vividly and for longer. This asymmetry is called negativity bias, and it is one of the most thoroughly documented patterns in human psychology. One harsh criticism tends to outweigh several genuine compliments. A single bad experience at a restaurant is more likely to determine whether you return than multiple good ones. In relationships, researchers have found that it typically takes around 5 positive interactions to offset the damage of a single negative one. The evolutionary logic is clear enough. For most of human history, missing a threat was potentially fatal, while missing an opportunity was merely unfortunate. A brain calibrated to prioritize danger over reward had a survival advantage. The problem is that the same calibration that protected early humans from predators now makes modern humans disproportionately sensitive to criticism, social rejection, bad news, and perceived slights in environments that are genuinely much safer. Negativity bias shapes the news landscape significantly. Negative headlines consistently outperform positive ones in engagement metrics, which creates commercial pressure for media to weight its coverage toward threats, conflict, and failure, regardless of whether that reflects the actual balance of events in the world. In-group bias. People consistently favor members of their own group over members of other groups, often without realizing they are doing it, and often on the basis of group membership that is entirely arbitrary. This is in-group bias, and experiments have shown it emerging even when groups are formed randomly and participants are fully aware the grouping is meaningless. In one famous series of experiments, psychologist Henri Tajfel assigned people to groups based on nothing more than which of two painters they slightly preferred, and within minutes, those groups were already allocating resources more generously to their own members than to the other group. The effect scales upward in intensity as group identity becomes more meaningful: nationality, religion, sports allegiance, political affiliation. Once a person identifies as a member of a group, they tend to see that group's actions more charitably, remember its successes more clearly than its failures, and apply stricter scrutiny to the behavior of outsiders. In-group bias is one of the foundational mechanisms behind tribalism, discrimination, and the persistent human tendency to treat moral rules as applying more firmly to how others should behave than to how we ourselves behave. Understanding it does not automatically neutralize it, but awareness of how quickly and automatically the brain draws group boundaries is a useful starting point for examining where those boundaries are actually coming from. The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon. You learn a new word, and suddenly you hear it everywhere. You buy a car in an unusual color, and suddenly you see that same color on roads constantly. The word or the car was always there at the same frequency, but something has changed in how your brain is processing the world around you. This experience is called the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, also known as frequency illusion, and it involves two cognitive mechanisms working together. The first is selective attention, which means that once your brain has flagged something as relevant or new, it starts pulling that thing out of the background noise and bringing it to your conscious attention. The second is confirmation bias, which then reinforces the feeling that this thing is appearing unusually often because each new sighting feels like evidence of a pattern. The name itself has an odd origin. In 1994, a reader of a Minnesota newspaper mentioned having heard about the Baader-Meinhof Group, a German militant organization, for the first time, and then encountering the name again the very next day. The newspaper printed the observation, and readers began writing in with their own identical experiences, which then caused even more people to start noticing the phenomenon in their own lives, a somewhat fitting demonstration of the effect itself. It is largely harmless as cognitive biases go, but it is a clean illustration of how much of what feels like objective observation of the world is actually the brain deciding in advance what is worth seeing.